Hello and welcome to Lecture 4 of this course, English 311 Advanced Composition, Fall 2015 at New Mexico State University. I am Dr. Renee Dupre, and I will be speaking today about integrating sources into your work. Here are the topics that I will cover today. It looks like a lot, but don't panic, they're actually quite brief. First, I'll talk a little bit about why we use sources in academic writing. Secondly, I'll talk about how you can use sources effectively. We'll look at the three major ways that you can use sources in your writing, when to quote versus when to paraphrase, how to use attributions, which are really important ways for you to distinguish between your own writing and that of other authors. I'll talk a little bit about some common problems that we see with use of quotations, and finally offer you some useful words for both attributions and transitions in your writing. I'll conclude with a brief look at mechanics, mostly to give you some references for places that you can go to figure out exactly where and how to put the commas, the quotation marks, and all of the other symbols that can help us to follow your work. First, why use sources? When you use sources, you're adding credibility to your writer. We just finished a unit on rhetoric. Which rhetorical appeal are you building when you use a source? Pop quiz. When you're using a source, you show your knowledge of the subject. You show that you know what some other people are saying about it. You can use it to invoke expert testimony. You can use that source to say, wow, a physician says this, or an engineer says this, or the leading expert on carbon emissions says this. You can invoke those people, bring their voices into your paper. You can also use it to build upon or reject others' arguments. Often you'll find that another expert in your field, or at least in the field of the topic that you were writing on, might have some really good ideas, and you might say, oh wow, I could take that idea one step further. Or you could say, well, I agree with him on points A, B, and C, but I disagree here, and if I disagree, that's going to lead us in a different direction and to a different conclusion. So those are some of the ways in which you can engage with sources. You can also use your sources, specifically direct quotations, when you want to share the texture of the writer's language with your readers. Generally, quotations are used in the humanities because the language, the voice of the writer that you are writing about is what is important. So that's a reason to use quotations. Using sources allows you to engage in a broader discussion on your topic. You are becoming part of the network of scholars who are addressing whatever it is that your topic is. And finally, probably at the most basic level, you can use sources to provide facts. Those facts may be things like percentages, specific statistics, things that have been researched and known, but might not be broadly known. It's one thing to know why to use sources. It's another thing to know how to use them effectively. You've heard this before, and I'm going to say it again. When you're using a source, you must integrate that source into your argument. That means clearly designating what your words and thoughts are as opposed to the words and thoughts of your source. When you're doing that, you can show why your source is there. It's really important that you explain why you're actually using that source, how that source is going to support the words and that you are saying, the arguments that you are proposing. It's really important that you remember to discuss your source's ideas in the context of your own ideas. Don't just summarize what your source says and pretend that that's your paper. Summarize what your source says as a way to augment your own argument. Here's a short example. For instance, say you were writing about descriptive rhetoric in Sharman Apt-Russell's essay Ghosts, which we discussed in class. The first thing you want to do is make your point about rhetoric. What kind of rhetoric does Russell use? Say she's developing the rhetorical appeal of pathos through her evocative descriptions of her father's death, or through her use of the question, what should I call my father? He died when I was 2. Those are some specific examples that you could use. And then explicate that example by analyzing the use of each word. There are 3 major ways that you can use sources in your paper. Those are summary, paraphrase, and quotation. I'm going to go over each one of them individually here just to give you some examples. A summary is basically a brief overview of your source's core purpose and key points. Here is an example taken from Atul Gawande's article in the New Yorker, Overkill, which we read in class. It's a very long article. He covers a tremendous amount of ground in it. But say in your writing about this, how could you summarize his main points, his purpose, and what he does in that article? Here's one suggestion. Atul Gawande in Overkill argues that unnecessary testing and care lead to rising healthcare costs and serious harm. Gawande examines recent research that shows that useless care is widespread in the United States, as well as providing several examples of such harmful care. He explains that the pervasiveness of unnecessary care is partly due to pressure on physicians to order tests and procedures, even when they are likely not necessary. However, he suggests a new model of care, one in which patients have easy access to primary care physicians who have ample time to spend with them, may help to improve health and reduce unnecessary care, and along with it, healthcare costs and harms. That would be a summary of his entire article. Your second option when using a source is paraphrase. When you're paraphrasing something, you are restating the author's ideas using your own words, sentence structure, and syntax. Simply changing the words is not enough. Simply changing the sentence structure and using the same words is not enough. You are transforming the author's words into your own, but you still need to cite and give attribution to the author for the idea. Here's an example, again from Gawande's Overkill. The original text reads like this. Could a backlash arrive and halt the trend? It's a concern. No one has yet invented a payment system that cannot be gamed. If doctors are rewarded for practicing more conservative medicine, some could end up stinting on care. An acceptable paraphrase of that would be as follows. Gawande, 2015, suggests that payment models designed to decrease unnecessary care may backfire if physicians game the system by withholding necessary care as well. A short, succinct summary of the main point that he makes in that statement. You'll notice that in that paraphrase I put quotation marks around the word game, partly because it's a unique usage of it, and secondly because Gawande actually used that word and it's a rather unique word. Finally, using quotes. Quotation is the act of using the author's words verbatim. It's when you use somebody else's words in your own writing, and when you do that, you must indicate whose words are whose. How do you do it? It seems pretty simple. You just copy and paste and plop them in, right? Not exactly. You still need to integrate them into your own argument. Again, from Gawande's Overkill. He is talking about Mrs. E, the patient with a very slow-growing thyroid cancer, who he treats. She did have a thyroid cancer, a microcarcinoma about the size of this O, with no signs of unusual invasion or spread. I wished we had a better word for this than cancer, because what she had was not a danger to her life and would almost certainly never have bothered her if it had not been caught on a scan. In your essay, you may wish to quote that as thus in the context of your own discussion of the importance of reducing unnecessary care. Gawande offers an example of unnecessary and potentially harmful care, the case of Mrs. E, a patient with a tiny and unproblematic thyroid cancer. Those are your words. These are the writer of the essay's words. A short summary there. Quote. Notice a colon is used, not a semicolon, to set off the quote after that independent clause. I wished we had a better word for this than cancer, because what she had was not a danger to her life and would almost certainly never have bothered her if it had not been caught on a scan. End quote. Parentheses, date, then period. So how do you decide which of those strategies to use to integrate sources into your essay? You're going to summarize if you answer yes to any of the following questions. Am I trying to explain a writer's purpose? Am I establishing background for my argument? Or do I need to describe several sources in a short paper? That's when you're going to turn toward the skill of summary. And that's different from simply using your paper to summarize other people's arguments. What about paraphrasing? Paraphrase when you can answer yes to any of the following questions. Could my own words convey the thought more succinctly and clearly? Generally, you're going to turn to paraphrase unless there's a good reason to quote. So, have I thought about reasons to quote and found none? Or are the reasons I have found just not compelling? A third consideration is your genre. Am I writing a paper for the social sciences or hard sciences? As I mentioned earlier, quotation is used, direct quotation is used most frequently in the humanities, where we really want to hear the texture of the author's language so that we can then go on to analyze it, when it is the text itself that we are analyzing rather than a research process or another sort of discovery in the hard science, in the soft sciences or the hard sciences. Anthropology may be a big exception there. When am I going to quote? If you are able to answer yes to any of the following questions, then indeed you should turn toward quoting. But remember that quotation is not your first or only way to use sources. Will I discuss the language of the text that I am quoting? I'm thinking of an excellent move that one of you made in your last paper, talking a little bit about the personification of trees in Scott Russell Sanders' essay, The Mind of Trees. Actually quoting that passage where he personifies it then allowed the writer to move on and discuss the ways that he personified those trees. Will I discuss the wording of a key component of the writer's assertion or theory? Am I going to be talking specifically not only about what the writer says, but how the writer says it? Is the writing especially beautiful or striking? Controversial or offensive? Is there something striking about the actual words and the way that they are written themselves? Do I have to put that in my paper as an example to give my reader a taste? Will I lose some of the writer's ideas if I paraphrase? There are some times when writers are so adept at explaining a complex idea that there's just no way you can really say it yourself in your own words. So am I going to lose those ideas? And finally, does the use of a quotation emphasize the writer's authority? Does it emphasize that I am really citing somebody who knows what they're talking about here? So as you're deciding how you're going to use your source in your paper, summarize, paraphrase, or quote, consider these questions. Use them as your guide. One thing that students often have trouble with is how to smoothly integrate those sources into your paper, especially if you are quoting. Attributions are key. An attribution is simply saying, wow, I am attributing this to its author or source. Your first option is to use what's called a signal phrase and then the quotation. The signal phrase tells you, look out, tells your reader, look out, here comes a quote. Somebody else said this. This is not my idea. Here's an example, again, from Gawande's Overkill. In Overkill, Gawande argues that, quotation, unnecessary care often crowds out necessary care, particularly when the necessary care is less remunerative. Then you'll note how to close that quote with the parentheses and the period on the outside of the parentheses, not inside the quotation marks. A second option for integrating quotations into your own sentences would look like this. In this example, you're using what's called an independent clause. Note that the first part of the sentence before the quotation could stand on its own as a sentence. It has a subject and a verb. So it is an independent clause followed by a colon, not a semicolon, but a colon, then the quotation. Gawande argues that unnecessary care not only is harmful in and of itself, but that it can often take the place of care that can truly help someone. So there you can see the independent clause is a summary / paraphrase of the point that's to come. Now we have the quotation again. Unnecessary care often crowds out necessary care, particularly when the necessary care is less remunerative. So those are two ways that you can work them in. Here are some common errors and things to avoid when you are quoting. First of all, do not write in this quote. An acceptable way to introduce would be as Gawande observes, says, mentions, suggests, argues. There's a whole bunch of words there. Or another way acceptable would be here we see. The most important thing you're going to be doing is integrating quotations into your own sentences, even if you have to break up the quotation to make it work. Another common error is using two quotes in a row without explication. Explication is your own very detailed explanation of the quotation, of the author's words. The fix: explain the meaning of the first quotation before moving on to the next. And if you don't feel like you have to interpret the quotation, then you shouldn't be quoting it. Quotations do not stand for themselves. When you quote something, then what you are doing is you're putting it in there as an example, and then you are offering your reader your interpretation of the author's words. Finally, quoting too much material. This is a common problem, especially when you're in a hurry. You just grab that long quote, plop it in there, and you know that what your point is and what you want to say is somewhere in there. Don't do that. Keep your quotations short and simple, and only quote what is absolutely necessary for your argument. That may mean that you're writing a sentence and you simply quote 2 words from the author and integrate them into your sentence. Or it may mean that those long quotations can become much shorter. Finally, here are some useful words, and yes, this PowerPoint will be available for you to download so you can use them. Some useful verbs that you can use when you are attributing a quote to somebody. In each one of these, you would have the author's name, last name, before using the verb, obviously. Points out, reflects, says, discusses, clarifies, writes, argues, suggests. Just some verbs. You will also need transition words to integrate your sources quickly or effectively. Here are some transition words that you can use not only for integrating sources, but for any sort of transition. In addition, however, despite, begins, opens, closes, contrasts, shifts to, juxtaposes, ends, moves to. Just some words that you can put in your toolkit. In terms of the mechanics of integrating sources, I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time right now talking about the specifics of how to do it. I will say that there are 2 major guides, unless you're in engineering, in which case you would be using CMS. But the 2 most commonly used style guides are the MLA, Modern Languages Association, and the APA, American Psychological Association styles. I'm sure that at this point in your careers you have run into both of them. Here's just a little comparison chart that can help you determine when to use which style. You're going to use MLA if you are writing in the humanities. That's English, languages, arts, history. Any of the humanities generally call for use of MLA as a style. In the MLA, the emphasis is on the authorship, because remember, the author is the actual creator of the text. In your writing, MLA calls for you to use active voice. And you will include in-text citations with page numbers for both quotations and paraphrases. At the end, your bibliographic information will be included in what is called a works cited. And to see the specifics of the MLA style, see the Purdue OWL guide that is the most current and easily accessible version. If you're writing a lot in MLA style, you may wish to purchase the actual style guide, or at least get it out of the library. You'll be using APA style if you're writing in the sciences, especially in the social sciences. The APA emphasizes date. You'll be writing in the passive voice, which of course drives those of us in the humanities nuts. But for some sort of pretense of objectivity, APA calls for the passive voice. Again, you'll be including in-text citations, and only quotations need page numbers, as opposed to in MLA where paraphrases and summaries also need those page numbers. Page numbers should be cited in APA in the reference list at the end. And that's another small difference. It's a reference list as opposed to a works cited included at the end of your essay. For more on APA style, see the Purdue OWL guide on that mode of writing, and I've given you the URL here. And that's all I have for today, and I will close with a thought from none other than Gandhi. Live as if you were to die tomorrow. Learn as if you were to live forever. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to seeing some incredible use of sources in your research papers.